Probably there are a few more people signing on, but we'll begin. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone. We have some of our regulars, some of our people who came who are specifically interested in this talk. And our teacher, our speaker tonight is Alana Kaplan, who is a museum educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as at the Derfner Judaica Museum. And among other things, she has created and leads an integrated learning and museum tour for both adult and school groups at the Met Museum. In terms of her education, she received her BA in Jewish History from Barnard College and a double master's from NYU in Jewish History and as well in Museum Studies. She lives in Teaneck with her family, and among her other qualifications, she originally is from St. Louis, like myself, so we'll give her some extra points for that as well. And her talk tonight is Ancient Egyptian Art and the Israelite Experience, which would be a fascinating talk any time of year, but is particularly appropriate in terms of the parshas that we're heading into. And so she'll be very interesting, and I'm sure we'll even perhaps as we read and hear the parshas upcoming weeks, maybe we'll hear them in a new and more in-depth way. So with that, I'll turn over to Alana. Oh, and of course we're recording this, just so everyone knows. And if you do have a question, when there's sort of a pause, we'll keep everyone on mute until you have a question during the presentation. And but you can unmute yourself and ask a question, and hopefully won't break up the flow too much. So with that, thank you very much, Alana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Hellman and the Young Israel of Brookline, for inviting me to be part of your Tuesday night speaker series. And as Rabbi Hellman said, I am from St. Louis. Our families go way back. Actually, my parents met in college at Rabbi Hellman's grandparents' Shabbos table, and our families have remained our parents are very good friends. So we go really way back. And as Rabbi Hellman said, this is a topic that I talk about a lot, but I'm especially excited to talk about it this week as we're beginning Parshat Shemot and really, delving into the whole story of the Jews being in Egypt. So I'm going to start my screen share. And everyone can see my picture of the Met. Thumbs up. Okay, great. So just a little bit of a background. I work in the education department at the Met, and the Met has one of the largest collections of ancient Egyptian art outside of Egypt. There are around 30,000 objects, ancient Egyptian objects in the Met's collection. It actually wasn't an area that I was studying when I started working there, but as I spent more time there and got to know the incredible collection that the Met has, and then just started thinking about it in terms of Jewish history and Tanakh, it became something I really was interested in and started exploring on my own. And what better way to do it than at this institution that has so many objects. So just to start off with a brief background, how does the Met have so many objects, over 30,000 objects from ancient Egypt? So in the early 1900s, actually, the Met, along with other institutions, were sending archaeologists to Egypt. And there was a system in place back then, which was called partage, which was, the word partage means the division of finds or to share. And basically, the Egyptian government and other archaeological sites in the Middle East and other countries basically were allowing archaeologists from around the world to come to their archaeological sites and to set up archaeological digs. And whatever they found was divided between Egypt and between the institutions and sent the archaeologists. So the Met, starting in the early 1900s, was sending archaeologists regularly to ancient Egypt, and basically half of what they found, they were able to bring back to the Met. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the system This partage system basically lasted until the 1970s. And since then, there's been a lot of discussion whether this was fair. There's one side that says this was very fair because, Egypt got the expertise and the manpower of archaeologists from around the world to help them find things. And they also got their objects in museums around the world to teach about their culture. But other people say, and of course, the host countries got many artifacts from ancient Egypt. Of course, other people say that it was really a system of colonialism and taking advantage of other countries. So the Met still sends archaeologists to Egypt and other places. There are archaeologists there today, but there's no more partage. They just send archaeologists to gain knowledge and not to bring back artifacts. But because of that system, that's how the Met really got the bulk of their over 30,000 objects from ancient Egypt. So that's kind of the beginning of our story. And the way that we're going to be looking at the objects today, of course, we're just going to get a taste of them because way too many objects to look at, would take years to go through all of them. But I'm going to look at ones that are really relevant to our story. And what we're going to be doing is two things. We're going to be doing a virtual tour of some of the rooms in the Met. And I'll enhance that with PowerPoint objects. Just something to keep in mind while we're doing the virtual tour is that the Google Street View was done in 2010, which is 11 years ago. So obviously the technology is not what it was today. So it's not as clear as virtual tours are, that are done today, but I will enhance it with my PowerPoint so that we can really see the objects very clearly. Okay, so here we're going to start with our story here, which is a picture that was taken in 1920 of an archaeological site in ancient Egypt. And this is actually where a lot of amazing finds were done by the Met's archaeologists. So in this area, they came across a tomb of a man named Mecca. Mecca was buried in 1986 BCE. And right after he was buried, his tomb, like many others' tombs, were invaded by grave robbers. For some reason, these grave robbers missed 2 rooms in the tomb. And the Met archaeologists in 1920 found these 2 rooms. So they hadn't been unearthed. They were, he was buried in 1986 BCE, and these 2 rooms were found in 1920. So we're talking, about 3,600 years later. And it was an unbelievable find for these archaeologists. So I'm going to show you, this is a picture of what the archaeologists found in 1920 when they first went into this room. So you might be able to make out, there are a lot of wooden models in this room. You might see some models of boats, some models, these are all wooden models of people, some animals. And this is exactly the way the room looked after not being, entered or gone into in about 3,600 years. So now it looks very different now. I'm going to show you how these models look in the museum. And it looks very different from this picture, and we will talk about this. So I'm going to just switch over to get a virtual tour of this room. Can everyone see that I switched and we're looking at the museum now? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, great. So we are now in the room of the models of the tomb of Mecca. You guys, you can see on the walls the ancient models of the tomb of Mecca. By the way, Mecca was not a pharaoh. He was an important person in ancient Egypt, and that's why he was buried with so many models, but he wasn't a pharaoh. But it does give us idea of all the things that people were buried with in ancient Egypt. Now, this is a story that I've been telling you on the wall. And then this is a picture on the left on the wall is a picture of what we were just looking at blown up. So now if you look in this room, you might see there's a case, a low glass case. It has some small wooden models in it. I know you can't see them so clearly. Don't worry, I'm going to show you pictures of them. But you can see that there are 5 wooden models, and these are models of Mecca's estate. I really want to show you this room just to give you an idea of the size of the objects, because when I do the PowerPoint, all of the objects look pretty much the same size. So you saw the models of the Mecca's estate, and these are models of boats. And you had seen in the picture that you saw some of the boats, but they looked a little bit broken or messed up a little bit. This is how they look when the museum put them together. Now, as we're looking at these models, just remember that these are only half of the models. So the other, 7 or 8 boats are in the museum in Egypt. We have half of the boats, we have half of the models, we have half of everything that was found in Mecca's tomb. And someone told me, someone who was in the museum in Cairo said that they have a room in the museum that looks exactly like our room here at the Met. So just to give everyone an idea of the models. Now, what's so amazing about this find? In general, it was an amazing find because it really shows what life was like in ancient Egypt through these models. So the Egyptians believed strongly in an afterlife, and they believed that they needed, or they wanted to have the things that they had in their life with them when they came back to life. So Mecca owned a lot of boats for travel and for trade. He couldn't be buried with those boats, but instead he had boats, models of boats made out of wood that he could be buried with, and models of his estate, so that when he came back to life, he would have all the objects that he had in his life. So now we see what they look like in the room. Any of you who have been to the museum might have been in this room. This is actually one of my favorite rooms in the galleries. But now we're going to go back to the PowerPoint to look at some of these objects a little bit closer up. Okay, so here's one of the models of the boats that we saw. Now we have it in color and a little bit clearer. So why are these models so important? So again, they bring to life life in ancient Egypt. They show us the importance of boats. Why were boats so important in Egypt? To travel, to trade on the Nile River. And of course, that tells us the importance of the Nile River. The Nile River is actually the longest river in the world. It goes through, right now, 10 countries. Different times that I've read it was sometimes 9 countries, 11 countries, but right now it goes through 10 countries, very long river. And it was so important in ancient Egypt. It was used for travel, it was used for trade, which is why boats were so important. It was also, of course, used to water, for agriculture, for drinking, for bathing. And so, of course, because the Nile River was so important, and we see that importance through these models, when it was turned to blood as the first plague, how devastating that would be. Not just for, sometimes we think about, the drinking water, bathing water, but also in terms of trade and travel, which was so important in ancient Egypt. That's what made Mecca such a well-to-do person, was this ability to do trade and travel and own all the boats that he owned. So these models really show us the importance of the Nile River. They also teach us so much about life in ancient Egypt. Again, remember, as you're looking at them, these were made in around 1986 BCE. So we're talking almost 4,000 years ago. They're made out of wood that's been painted. And we get an idea of how what boats looked like. This person on the end of the boat is dipping something into the Nile River to make sure it is high enough so that they can travel. As we know, the Nile River sometimes is very high, or it overflows, or it's very low. In ancient Egypt, they thought that was controlled by the gods and goddesses, whether they were happy or angry or happy with the people. We know, of course, it has to do with tide and the seasons. But the other thing to look at is the clothing that they're wearing. They're wearing clothing made out of linen. This is linen that was almost 4,000 years old. The reason, by the way, these boats really could last, they're made out of wood, and they were in an airtight tomb in the very dry climate of ancient Egypt. And that's why they were able to last so long. Interestingly, the use of linen in ancient Egypt, which we can think about in terms of shatnez, about not wearing linen and wool together. Well, linen, although today might not be such a popular material to wear, back then it was very popular. Not only was all the clothing made out of linen, but also what they wrapped the mummies in was also made out of linen. Now, in this boat is mostly slaves. So we see there was a very large class of slaves in ancient Egypt. And we have in the boat under the awning is Mecca. Mecca is always sitting, and he's never working. So everybody else is working except for Mecca. So as you saw in the virtual tour, that there were a number of boats. We have 7 of these boats. I'm just going to show you a couple of them just to give you an idea of, again, why boats were so important, why the Nile River was so important. This is a fishing and fowling boat. So you can see that they are spear fishing. And they have a lot of different animals on board here that they're getting for Mecca, who is the man who's, again, sitting. He has no job. He's just sitting, and everybody else around him is working. So boats were also important for fishing and fowling and for traveling. The other thing is that boats were a symbol of travel to the afterlife. They believed in ancient Egypt that they would travel to the afterlife in boats. And indeed here, Mecca Ray is sitting on his stool. He's holding a lotus flower, which is a symbol of the afterlife. So boats, the Nile River, very important in ancient Egypt. And this, again, gives us a way to visualize many things about boats, about ancient Egyptians, about the clothing that they wore. And now moving on to I had shown you also the models of Mecca Ray's estate that we were looking at in the virtual tour, that there were 5 models in those glass cases. So these to me really bring to life a number of the things that we learn about in Tanakh, of the story of the Jews in ancient Egypt. So our first model is Mecca Ray's slaughterhouse. Now, again, Mecca Ray wanted these models made and to be buried with, so that when he came back to life, he would have, you know, all of his home and all the things that he had on his estate with him in the afterlife. So this is a model of Mecca Ray's slaughterhouse. I'm actually just going to show you a bird's eye view of that so we can see it a little better. This shows us how they slaughtered animals in ancient Egypt, right? So we can see the cows on the ground. We can see the meat hanging up to dry. We can see the barrels of blood in the corner. And another very interesting thing is looking at the servants or the slaves and the hierarchy. So we see that they're slaves that are slaughtering the animals. And then there are other slaves that are standing on top of them with swords on their shoulders, making sure that they do the work. So to me, this brings to mind immediately the idea of taskmasters. And I will show you some sources later where we, talk about the idea of Egyptian taskmasters, where we have, people who are in charge of the slaves and making sure that they're doing their work at the threat of being, hit or hurt with these spears. So something very interesting about this is that a lot of people often say to me, oh, Egyptians didn't eat meat. They worshiped animals, so they didn't eat meat. But we do know not only from this visual here, from this model of Mecca Ray's estate, that they did indeed eat meat, but also from our source here that we have from Shemot, where it says that the Jews said, if only we had died by the hand of Hashem in the land of Egypt, when we sat by al-sir habasar, by the flesh pots, or, indicating that they were eating meat, v'achlenu lechem, when we would eat, our fill of bread. So the idea of eating meat and bread, two very important staples of food in ancient Egypt that the Jews were lamenting that they didn't have in the Midbar. So we saw the reference to meat, and now we're going to see a reference to the idea of bread in our next model. So here's the next model in the models of Mecca Ray's estate. This is actually my favorite model, and I use this a lot when I'm teaching students. I have a lot of day schools and high schools that ask me to do tours of the Egyptian galleries, connected to their curriculum. And I love using this model as a visual to talk about. I don't know if anyone has figured out what this is a model of, but it's a model of an ancient Egyptian granary. So now this is Mecca Ray's granary. It's small. By the way, these models are about 30 inches long, just to give you an idea. But it helps us visualize what the granary in ancient Egypt would have looked like. And of course, we read previously in the Parshiot about Yosef being in charge of the granary in ancient Egypt. That was really his job. And here we see a visualization of that in Mecca Ray's granary. And I see that people are putting things in the chat, and I will answer them as I go along. So we see Mecca Ray's granary here, and it's a really unbelievable visual. So we have people sitting down here who are recording how much grain comes in and how much grain goes out. And we know, of course, that Yosef did the same thing, kept very strict records of how much grain there was. And then here we have people bringing the grain in their sacks on their back, and they're pouring it into these pits. Now you can see in the pits actually have little pieces of grain, and we know that Mecca Ray had actual grain that he was buried with in his tomb, because when the archaeologists went into the tomb, when they opened it up in 1920, there were rat droppings in this model, and they realized that the rats, which are the only thing that were able to get into these airtight tombs, had eaten a lot of the grain that Mecca was buried with. So this is, again, an unbelievable visual. Now, why was grain so important in ancient Egypt? And we'll look at our next model, the Mecca models, to see why was grain so important. They use it to make bread and beer. And this is, again, a visualization of that. I'm going to do this is the same one, just a bird's eye view. So you can see on the right that they're making bread, and on the left, they're making beer, two very important staples in ancient Egypt, bread and beer. Beer was made of grain mixed with water from the Nile River, and it fermented. And that was a regular drink in ancient Egypt. It wasn't an alcoholic drink. It was a regular drink that they would drink. So again, here we see really the importance of grain, why it was so important, why Pharaoh appointed Yosef in charge of this very important commodity. By the way, grain was not just used to make bread and beer, it was actually used as a commodity to trade for other things to other countries. And so here we have the source, a couple of sources that relate directly to this idea. So from Breshit, what we already read about and learned about in previous parshiot was Pharaoh getting angry with his chief cupbearer, his chief baker. So the idea of having a chief baker and a chief cupbearer who was in charge of wine, but we'll group wine is one thing, and then the chief baker in charge of the bread. But the idea of bread being such an important staple in ancient Egypt, and then of course the reference to Yosef, gathering the grain for 7 years, the importance of grain, and the idea of storing grain. So it says he stored them in cities. So he had huge storehouses. We just are seeing a model of Mecca-Ray's storehouse, which is much smaller. But again, it allows us to envision and visualize and to understand the importance of grain in ancient Egypt. And our last model that is in the Mecca-Ray estate was his garden. And again, all these models are made out of wood. They've been painted and very well preserved. So just to go back to our original picture, because when I first showed it to you, we didn't really know what we were looking at. Now, when you're looking at this picture, this is what the one of the rooms in Mecca-Ray's tomb looked like. Right when the archaeologists entered and unearthed this room. So you can see, you'll probably recognize now, you can see the garden, the model of the garden. Another model here in the corner, you can see some of the boats. Some of you might wonder why things seem to be a little bit in array in this picture. And I had said that no one had touched these tombs since Mecca was buried. But of course, there are a lot of earthquakes and earth movements in Egypt. So because of that, things did get a little bit maybe broken or dismantled, but the museum put them together, did not add anything to do them, didn't change anything, but kind of just put them together so that we could view them in a good way. Okay, so we are going to go on to our next topic, which is a question that I get very often, talking about the pharaohs and the timing of the Jews in ancient Egypt and the timing of the Exodus. So before I start off with that topic, there are many different opinions to who the Pharaoh was of the Exodus, who the Pharaoh was during the times the Jews were enslaved. And of course, it's tricky because you have Egyptian chronology and Egyptian dating. You have dating from the Tanakh. And of course, we know Ein Mukdam U'Me'uchar Torah, the Torah isn't a history book. We're not looking at it for chronology, but we do have certain years or certain things that we can figure out from the Torah. And there are different opinions about this, and I'm going to present a couple of different opinions that I've read and that I've researched. And we'll start off here just with this source from Melachim Aleph, which talks about in the 480th year after the Jews left Egypt, in the month of Ziv, which is Iyar, the second month, in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, Shlomo began to build the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so here we have a source in Melachim Aleph, which talks about Shlomo building the Beit HaMikdash in his 4th year of his reign, which is 480 years after the Jews left Mitzrayim. So according to this, it's saying that the 4th year of Shlomo's reign was probably about 966 BCE, give or take according a couple of years. And if that's 400 years after, that's around 1446 BCE, around that year. So there are people who date the Exodus to 1446 or 1450 BCE. So if we go according to that date, we'll use that date for a little bit. Then the Pharaoh at that time, according to Egyptian dating and chronology, is a Pharaoh whose name was Thutmoses III. So there's a lot of very interesting background to this. Thutmoses III, his father was Pharaoh, Thutmoses II. And then when he passed away, Thutmoses III was only 2 months old. He was only 2 years old. So he was very young. So what happened was his stepmother, whose name was Hatshepsut. Many of you might have heard the name Hatshepsut before. And if anyone has children or grandchildren in 6th grade, that's a year that they learn about ancient Egypt. And that's a name I know that they learn a lot about the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. So Thutmoses III, it was his stepmother and also his aunt, was Hatshepsut. And she decided when her husband died, so her husband was Thutmoses II, her husband was actually also her stepbrother. It's very complicated, but she decided when her husband died that instead of the 2-year-old stepson ruling, she would make herself ruler until he was old enough, or co-ruler, but she really was ruling. Now, this was very interesting. She made herself the pharaoh, and we're going to see how this played out in the sculptures of her. Now, why is this so important? Because, as I said, according to the dating, her stepson, Thutmoses II, is possibly the pharaoh of the Exodus, which would mean that she was pharaoh during the time where the Jews were being enslaved. So I want to look at that through sources, and I want to also look at that through sculptures in the museum. Okay, so here is a Sphinx of Hatshepsut that is in the museum. It's in the room with the Temple of Dendor, which I will show you later on in a virtual tour. But just a little bit of background of this sculpture. So this is a Sphinx of Hatshepsut. There's no way that you would know this is Hatshepsut without my telling you, because certainly there are no indications that she's a female, and there are no indications of who she is. If you look at sculptures from ancient Egypt, most of the faces all look very similar. There are no personalized features. So the way that we know who people are by hieroglyphics. So you might see in the middle of the sculpture here that there are hieroglyphics which say that this is Hatshepsut. And you'll notice that she presents herself as a male. And in most of the sculptures of Hatshepsut, she does look like a male. Remember, she wasn't supposed to be pharaoh, and she wanted to be taken very seriously as a pharaoh. So she really presented her as a male pharaoh with, the headdress and the false beard of the pharaoh. In most of her sculptures, she does look like a male. By the way, she was a very powerful ruler, and she was a very successful ruler for Egypt. She wasn't interested in going to war, which many pharaohs were, but she was very interested in increasing and enhancing trade in ancient Egypt. So she made a lot of trade routes. She was very powerful, and she ruled for about 20 years. So I want to just take us to the museum, to the virtual tour, because I want you there were many, many sculptures made of Hatshepsut during her reign. And in all of them, in most of them, she is shown as a man, as shown as very powerful, larger than life, to back up her claim of being pharaoh, because she really, made herself pharaoh and wasn't supposed to be. So we're going to go back into the museum. Whoops. Oh, that's actually a picture of me near the Sphinx in the museum when I was there a couple of weeks ago, just to give an idea a little bit of the size of the sculpture. Okay, and then we're going to go into Oops. We're just going to go into our virtual tour. 1 second here. Okay. Okay, so here we are back in the museum, and this is a room full of Hatshepsut sculptures. I don't know if you have been here before. Unfortunately, it would be nice if there were actually a person in this picture just to get an idea of the size of these sculptures, but I hope you can get an idea just, by looking at other things in the room, the bench, these cases, which cases are usually the height so that you can see the, from your eyes, you can look into a case. So when I'm standing in this room talking, and I usually like to stand in between these two huge sculptures of Hatshepsut. I reach about to where she's holding these jars in her hand. That's about as tall as I am when I'm in this room. So you get an idea, these sculptures are huge. They are lifelike sculptures. Just to give you an idea of the size of them. Here behind, you can see there's some labels. So the labels are about, a little bit higher than my head would be. So these are really huge lifelike sculptures of, larger than life, I should say, of Hatshepsut. Notice that she looks like a male in all these sculptures. In these sculptures, she's kneeling and giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. And again, she wants to show that she really was a strong, powerful ruler. And the importance of these sculptures, I think, for us is to realize how powerful the pharaohs thought that they were. We always talk about the pharaohs and saying how they view themselves as gods, but looking at these sculptures, they really believe that, and they really impose that on the people. So people were really very scared of the pharaohs. So just thinking about the story of Moshe and approaching Pharaoh and asking for the Jews to go and that whole all those stories against these very strong, powerful leaders who have these larger than life sculptures made of them, really, I think, brings all of that to life. Now, there are a couple of sculptures of Hatshepsut where she does appear more feminine, including these two over here, which we will look up. We'll look at them closer in my PowerPoint because you can't see details. But another thing to notice about these sculptures, especially this one on the end, and some of the larger sculptures, is that a lot of them are broken. Now, people say to me, oh, well, they're, almost 4,000 years old. That's why they're broken. But if you take sculptures, these sculptures are carved out of huge slabs of marble or granite. They could last forever unless, something is done to them. So a lot of these sculptures actually were purposely damaged by Tutmosis III. By Tutmosis III, which is Hatshepsut's stepson and nephew. When he came to power, he was angry that Hatshepsut had, become co-ruler with him and taken over. He had many of her sculptures purposely destroyed. And what's the easiest thing to destroy on these sculptures made out of stone? That would be, things that stick out. So a lot of times it's the nose or the snake on top of the headdress. So here you see like a lot of the face has been damaged, sometimes hands, things that stick out and aren't, part of these solid piece that it was carved out of. So I just wanted you to take a look at these sculptures, again, noticing the size of them compared to the labels. This one we'll see a little bit closer up, and noticing that most of them, besides being larger than life, are also show Hatshepsut as a male to show her power. Okay, so we're going to go back and see a couple of these sculptures just a little bit clearer. Here we go. We were just looking at this one in the room. So again, she's shown as a male, larger than life, with the false beard of a pharaoh and the headdress. But this one is one where she's shown as a female. And we can see, she's wearing a dress, she's wearing a necklace. We can see the pleats of her skirt. Of course, we know it's Hatshepsut because of the hieroglyphics here. And of course, you'll notice parts of it that are broken. That was done on purpose by Tutmosis III to kind of take power away from her. By destroying images, they believe that they were taking power away from them. So now, going back to our story, we're going to look at a couple of sources. So in this week's Parsha, right, we talk about Vayakam melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada Yosef. A new king came up who didn't know Yosef. So Rashi says perhaps it was a new king, perhaps it was the same king, but he had new policies. So if we're going according to the idea that Tutmosis II was a pharaoh of the Exodus, And we have to play with the dates a little bit, but there are opinions that say that actually Hatshepsut was this new king, that she was the new king. And there was an opinion that says Vayakam Melech Hadash actually refers to a usurper, that it wasn't a king who was supposed to be king, but it was a usurper. And that's why this language was used, which would fit in with our story because Hatshepsut was not supposed to be the Pharaoh. The other interesting thing is when the Pharaoh tells the midwives about, when they deliver the babies, about, killing the boys. And the language that's used is, the Pharaoh said, Vayoma biyad beyaledchen et ha'ivriot re'iten al ha'avnayim. So that's a birthing stool. And it was a specific stool that midwives used to help the birth process. So it's interesting that the Pharaoh was so familiar with this. So if it were a female Pharaoh, that would fit in, that she was very familiar with the birthing process. Hatshepsut herself, although Tutmosis II was her stepson, she did have her own children. So that's interesting that she really knew what about the birthing process and was telling the midwives. And the other interesting thing is, if you think about the story, the midwives, of course, didn't listen. They didn't follow this. And we never hear that they were punished or reprimanded. So that could be because, again, this was the royal household, the royal kingdom was kind of in a disarray because Hatshepsut had made herself Pharaoh. So it could have been that, they were not, that there were also some people who were very upset that Hatshepsut made herself Pharaoh. So even though some of her laws, her rules were not being followed, there was no punishment for that because a lot of people were upset that Hatshepsut was the ruler. So it's an interesting way to look at these psukim. And then, of course, if we go later on to Parak Bet, and it talks about Vayhi bayamim harabim ha'hem vayamat melech Mitzrayim, right? So the king of Egypt died. So according to this pasuk, we see that there was a different Pharaoh. The Pharaoh who of the Exodus was a different Pharaoh than the Pharaoh of bondage. So that could also work because Hatshepsut died. She ruled for 20 years. She died. And then Tutmosis III took over. He ruled for another 32 years afterwards. And according to the opinions that the Exodus happened in around 1450 BCE, Tutmosis III would be Pharaoh at that time. And he would have been this new Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, there are other opinions, and I'm sure many of you have heard the opinion that the Pharaoh was actually Ramses. So there is an opinion that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses. And there are a lot of complications with this opinion. So first of all, people say that it was Ramses II, and he ruled, according to that opinion, the Exodus happened in 1290 BCE. Now, of course, that would not go along with the source that we read from Malachim Aleph. But why do people say it was Ramses, who is the Pharaoh? And a lot of people base it on these psukim about the Jews building these cities, Pitom and Ramses. So because the city Ramses is mentioned, so Ramses must have been the Pharaoh, and that must be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So there are a number of loopholes with that explanation. First of all, there was a city called Ramses much earlier. We see the second source in Bereshit, right? When Yosef settled his family in Goshen, that was in the area of Ramses. So we have this name Ramses much earlier. The other thing is there were many pharaohs named Ramses. There was Ramses first, the second, the third. Actually, there was a Ramses that ruled in Egypt for 230 years. So there were many pharaohs named Ramses. So, connecting it either to the name Ramses and then saying that it's Ramses II, it has a lot of loopholes with that connection. Now, Ramses II did happen to be a very powerful ruler. He's the most well-known Ramses and the most celebrated pharaoh in ancient Egypt, which is perhaps why people also think that he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. He actually ruled for 67 years, which is pretty unbelievable at that time period that someone even lived that long, let alone ruled for that long. He was the longest ruling pharaoh. He was a very strong and powerful pharaoh. Again, the idea of the power of the pharaohs and what the Jews were up against. And I'm going to show you, this is actually a picture of me when I went to Egypt when a long time ago in 1992 when I was studying there for the year. I was studying in Israel for the year and I went with a friend to Egypt. And I couldn't get over these sculptures specifically of Ramses. These are sculptures of Ramses and you can see how large they are. My friend is lying down next to it. So you can see, and I'm standing next to it here. These sculptures in Egypt, and we don't have these sculptures in the museum. I mean, they're just huge, larger than life. Again, the idea of, if you imagine the Jews living in ancient Egypt this time and seeing these, kind of sculptures and the power of the pharaohs and what that must have been like. So it really, I think, helps visualize, the fear and, some of the things that they went through. And the fact that these pharaohs really thought of themselves as gods and larger than life, and had all these kind of even propaganda, or, it reminds me almost of these posters that used to go up of Mao Zedong and other rulers, of like these huge people who are always watching you and always over you and always controlling you. So I think these sculptures just bring all those ideas, really bring them to life. Interestingly, I'm just throwing this in because when I went to Egypt, I got a lot of comments about how you're not allowed to go to Egypt. And I did a lot of research on that at the time. And, just showing this one source of Rambam Maimonides about the idea that it's permissible to return to Egypt to conduct business or commerce or conquer, but it's a problem to live there. So now, or he says here, the prohibition is against residing permanently there. So I know a question that will come up is, of course, that Rambam himself lived there. And I read many different, ways to deal with this. There are people who say that this prohibition was only if you go directly from Israel to Egypt, or it was only at a time period when the Egyptians were a really immoral people, but or it was only during, you could only go to Egypt you couldn't go to Egypt the way that the Jews had gone down, but you could go a different way. So there are a lot of different ways around that. But interestingly, I did read that the Rambam himself signed some of his letters saying that he transgressed this commandment. So, there are, of course, also opinions that say if you go there without meaning to really live there for a long period of time, just to kind of sojourn there for a short amount of time, then it's also permitted. And I don't think he had planned to stay there as long as he did. So anyway, but looking at these sources, it does seem that there's not a problem with visiting there. And in fact, there are many archaeologists, Tanakh archaeologists, who go to Egypt and do research there. And they always point me to this source as allowing them to do that. Okay, so this is a facsimile painting of the funeral of Ramses. So there were lots of sculptures and lots of paintings that were made of and dedicated to Ramses, the second Ramses the Great. And I want to bring us into the museum just to look at these facsimile paintings. So I think I had said at the beginning that the Met has over 30,000 objects and they're all real from ancient Egypt, except for these facsimile paintings. And we are now in the museum in the hallway with these facsimile paintings. Again, another one of my favorite parts of the museum. So now why don't we have the real paintings? Because these paintings were painted on people's tombs. And obviously the museum couldn't take the walls of the tombs and bring them back. So they did, I guess, what is the next best thing? And they sent artists from the museum to Egypt in the 1920s with the archaeologists. These artists sat in these dark tombs and they copied the tomb paintings exactly what they saw. So in fact, our facsimile paintings from the 1920s, the 1930s are in much better condition than the originals, because the originals were exposed to the environment, they were exposed to the weather in ancient Egypt, to visitors. So our paintings are in much better condition. What I love about these paintings, again, is they really tell us about ancient Egyptian life. I know you probably can't see them so clearly, but I will show you close-ups of them. But just to, give us an idea of ancient Egyptian life, how people, the clothing that people wore. Here's a painting of a pharaoh and his wife who's standing behind him. Of course, the pharaohs were always painted as the largest people because size indicated importance, but it showed us, their clothing, it showed us their jewelry, it showed us different things that they did in terms of agriculture. It showed us what kind of pets they have. We see cats in a lot of these paintings, that they had cats as pets. Different, agricultural work that they did, how they took care of animals, family relations, what people did for fun, things like that. So really, again, it brings life in ancient Egypt to life. The other thing you might notice actually is that these paintings, the way that they're painted, is not, we don't see the whole person, right? We only see the profile of the people, and all the paintings are painted the same. We see the profile, right? We only see one eye. We see the kind of the sideways, and we'll see that closer in some of our close-ups. So if it's a sculpture, like the sculptures we saw, it's a full frontal view, but paintings, we only see a profile. And interestingly, again, there are no personalized features. So you can't tell who these people are in the paintings, but we get an idea of who everyone is based on the size. The larger a person is, the more important. The smaller they are, they were workers or they were slaves. And again, we can just learn a lot about the way people dressed and what they did in terms of working, the importance of the Nile, the importance of agriculture, which again, just brings stories in Tanakh to life for us. So we're going to go back to our PowerPoint just so we can see a couple of these paintings a little bit closer up. So this was a funeral for Ramses. This is, I don't know if you saw it on the wall, but this one I just think is so interesting. It's an artist workshop. So this shows us artists preparing objects that would be put in a pharaoh's tomb. And this was something artists worked out throughout the life of a pharaoh. And then when they died, they were, buried with the objects. Again, it shows us the size indicates someone's importance. So we have the guy sitting on the left is the most important. The slaves are not as important, and different things that they're making for a tomb, jewelry, a sphinx. It also shows us the very, primitive materials that they had to make all of these sculptures, which is something also to think about when you're looking at the sculptures that we were looking at, that they were made out of solid stone, and they were made using a hammer and a chisel. So here you can see this guy making a small sphinx, and he has a rock in his hand and a piece of metal. And this is how they were making these unbelievable sculptures using very simple tools. I always say, even if I had the most advanced lasers, I couldn't make these things, and they were making them without any, art degrees, without any art knowledge, without any advanced tools. So it's really pretty unbelievable. And again, just looking at the different paintings to enhance our understanding of ancient Egyptian life, agricultural life, food that they ate, animals. And we know about all of this, of course, because of the hieroglyphics that explain what's going on. Okay, the last area that we're going to look at together, and then we'll get to questions, is the Temple of Dendor. This is probably the most popular room in the Met's ancient Egyptian galleries. And it's a room where you're supposed to feel as if you're in ancient Egypt. So if you look, this is a picture of the room. I will do a little virtual tour of it, but the picture is probably clearer than the tour, just to give us an idea how you're supposed to feel like you're in ancient Egypt. So we have the Nile River here. We have sculptures of pharaohs. We have the windows which look out into Central Park, which are curved to look like pyramids. We have the ancient temple, which we see back here. Next to it is the Sphinx of Hot Shepherd, which looks very tiny from here, but that's the Sphinx that we were looking at before. And the whole room is supposed to give us a feeling that we are in ancient Egypt. Again, it's interesting to relate to the story of when Moshe was asking Pharaoh to let the Jews go out to worship, and to give us an idea of how they worshiped in ancient Egypt. So this is a temple, an ancient Egyptian temple. People would not go inside of it. Actually, only a priest would go inside of it, but the people would stand outside. So they would worship in these temples outside. They were also worshiping multiple gods. So That also made it very difficult for them to have these strange people, the Jewish people, who worshipped one God. The idea of monotheism was very strange and very threatening to them, because they believed in many, many gods, which I'll show you images on the temple, and gods that control many gods who controlled many different things in their lives. So they found this idea of monotheism and the Jewish belief in one God to be very threatening idea. So we're just going to go to a virtual tour of this room. And as I said, I think my picture is clearer than the virtual tour, but just to give us an idea of what the room looks like. And we'll go around a little bit here. So there are actually sculptures on the left side of goddess, who was a goddess of plagues and war. And there actually were 60, her name is Sekhmet. There were 60 of these sculptures made of her. I think the Met has about 6 of them. And you'll notice that it's a face of an animal and the body of a human, which again, that's why people had this idea that Jews did not, ancient Egyptians didn't eat meat, because they worshipped animals and used them to represent their gods and goddesses. By the way, they did that. The reason they show their gods and goddesses as half animal, half human, right? It's the face of a lion and the body of a female, which is actually the opposite of a sphinx. But the reason they did that is to show that their gods and goddesses were so powerful. They had the powers of humans and they had powers of animals. So that's why they presented them in this way. So now if we go down the hallway, this is the Temple of Dendor. And I'm going to show you a lot of this in my PowerPoint, so we can see it clearer. But these are actually pictures on the wall showing the Temple of Dendor when it was in Egypt. And again, I'll show you these clearer and closer up in the PowerPoint. But I just wanted to also show you the Sphinx of Hot Shepherd, which is over here. I'd shown you that and a picture of myself next to that. And then this is the Temple of Dendor itself. And you'll notice, you might be able to see that there are carvings on the wall of pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. You will also notice there's a little bit of color, because this would have been painted red, yellow, green, and blue. Originally, it wouldn't have just been this stone, but we have very little color left. Now you are able to go into the first room of the Temple of Dendor when you're at the museum. There's not really that much to look at. It basically has the same carvings that we're seeing on the outside. But just so you get a feeling of the room and the idea that you're supposed to feel like you're in ancient Egypt when you're in this room. Okay, so we are going to go back to our PowerPoint and just look at some of these things a little bit clearer and talk about the story of the Temple of Dendor. So the Temple of Dendor was originally in Egypt. This is what it looked like. This is a picture from 1920, what it looked like on the banks of the Nile River. Now you will notice that you don't see the Nile River anywhere in this picture, because it was built pretty far away from the Nile River. And many temples were built over here for people to worship the various gods and goddesses. The Temple of Dendor was built for the goddess Isis. And as I said, they believed in many different gods. So this is what it looks like when it was in Egypt. Now we're going to just go through the story. Here's the Temple of Dendor in Egypt, again, in the early 1900s. You might notice some graffiti on it, which unfortunately, when people used to visit, they would write or carve their names into it. And you can see the images we were looking at before. So now we see the same Temple of Dendor, but now the Nile River has flowed over, and very much it's flooded, because we didn't even see the Nile River in our original pictures. And basically what was happening was, after the building of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, the Nile River was overflowing and it was destroying these ancient Egyptian temples. So here we see the Nile River has almost totally covered the Nile River. So what happened is that in the early 1960s, the Egyptian government asked the American government for help with this issue, help save these national treasures. And the American government sent engineers, and they sent people to help them control the water of the Nile River so that it wouldn't overflow and ruin all these ancient Egyptian treasures. So as a thank you, the Egyptian government wanted to give a thank you to the United States. So they said, we are going to give you one of our temples. We're going to give you the Temple of Dendor. Of course, every museum in the United States wanted the Temple of Dendor, especially the Smithsonian's. So they had a kind of like a contest to see what museums would do with it. And the Met said they would build an entire wing, new wing onto the museum to house the Temple of Dendor, and they would make it, you feel as if you were in ancient Egypt with the Temple of Dendor. So they won the contest. The Egyptians liked that idea. And the Temple of Dendor was brought to the United States. That was a huge undertaking, of course. These are just a couple of pictures, which some of these pictures you might have seen were on the wall when I was showing you the virtual tour. So of course it had to be taken apart brick by brick. Many detailed plans were made. Then it was shipped over to the United States, to the port in New York. This is what the Met looked like before the Temple of Dendor. They had to build on that whole wing onto the Egyptian wing, overlooking Central Park. This is what it looked like as they were building it. And this is the early 1970s. And here's what it looks like as they were building up the room. And what it looks like today. This is a picture at night. So now you can really see the carvings. It's unbelievable, the carvings of the pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses, again, showing the importance of the gods and goddesses in ancient Egypt. This is actually a picture of the inside, which we weren't able to see before. Same idea of these different carvings. And again, it really shows the skill, the technical skill of ancient Egyptian artists and artisans. Again, they had no, formal training in art. They had nobody to rely on in terms of past art movements and very simple tools. This is just a close-up. Again, we know all of this because of the hieroglyphics. A lot of hieroglyphics are carved into the Temple of Dendor. And of course, we see different goddesses represented as half animal, half human, and the pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. This might remind you of the sculpture of Hatshepsut, where she was holding things in her hand, offering offerings to the pharaohs. Offerings to the gods and goddesses from the pharaohs. Again, you'll notice the carvings are in profile, as opposed to the sculptures, which are fully frontal views. All the paintings and raised relief carvings are profile. And the Egyptians were showing this way that they could represent humans both fully frontal, showing their whole face, and also sideways. And it really showed their skill as artists and artisans. Again, just a close-up of the side of the Temple of Dendor and seeing the leftover paint. And now you understand why there's only paint on the highest levels of the Temple of Dendor, because the water didn't impact the highest levels as much. As I had said, the whole thing would have originally been painted. They did have paint in ancient Egypt from berries, from snails, from, that's how they had, natural color that they used as paint. This is a picture of me in the museum from a couple of weeks ago, and the museum actually is using, this overhead projector to project color onto the temple, just to give us an idea of what it really would have looked like. Because we all have this image of it that it would have just been stone, but it actually would have been very brightly painted, these temples. And then these are more hieroglyphics. You'll notice, by the way, that the outside of the Temple of Dendor is raised relief carvings, and the inside is carved is incised carvings. So again, just the unbelievable skill of the artisans. And then, of course, unfortunately, you see that the visitors who visited the Temple of Dendor before, while it was still in ancient Egypt, would carve their names. As far back as the 1800s, people were visiting and carving their names. Unfortunately, that's something that we can't get rid of. But again, just, seeing these unbelievable images, getting an idea of the size of these temples and the importance of the gods and goddesses to the ancient Egyptians, also, brings to light one of the reasons that the Egyptians and Pharaoh found the Jews worshiping their God or leaving so threatening. So I think I'm going to actually end my talk here. We've covered a lot of ground, and I know there are a number of questions, so I want to leave time for questions and comments And so I can spend some time on that as well. So I don't know if people want to unmute or how we want to do the question part.
I think anyone who wants to just unmute and ask anything or make any comment, feel free.
How does the daughter of Pharaoh who found Moshe fit in with your proposal that it was Hatshepsut who was the Pharaoh at the time?
So it's very interesting. Again, like it's hard to fit in all the things from Tanakh, and especially because not everyone, there are people who say it was Hatshepsut, there are different opinions. But interestingly, Hatshepsut she had a daughter, and we do actually know some information. We don't always know information about Pharaoh's children if they didn't become pharaohs themselves. But we do have some information about Hatshepsut's daughter that she had with Tutmosis II. She was, of course, only one of his many wives and also his stepsister. So it was very complicated. But so that could, conceivably fit in.
A question is, I'll raise the obnoxious question that I'm sure you get. Somebody raises every time you give an educational tour. Is there any archaeological or literary evidence of our having been in Egypt that has survived?
Right. Okay. So that's a very good question. And actually, a couple of years ago, when I was in Israel, the Israel Museum had this whole exhibit on. It was very controversial because it was a whole exhibit on, the Exodus from Egypt. Did it really happen? Because there really isn't any clear archaeological evidence. Now, there are different ways that we can, talk about this. So first of all, the fact that, people say, all these people leaving ancient Egypt, how could there be no evidence of it, right? So now the Egyptians, as you've seen from what we're looking at, really controlled information and what stories they wanted to be told, right? Look at Hatshepsut. She showed herself as a male pharaoh. That's the story she wanted to be told. So ancient Egyptians would not have wanted it to be known that their slaves left en masse and destroyed them through plagues. So any evidence that there might have been certainly would have been destroyed, covered up. But there's also the opinion that there's a reference to the Hittites that we have both in Egypt and also in some Tanakh sources. And there are people who say that that is actually a reference to the Jews, that they're referred to as the Hittites. So, there are different ways to deal with it. And then, there are people who use this lack of information to say that it never happened. But I think the two very brief answers that I gave are certainly ways that you could say that definitely disprove that idea that it never happened, because there's no clear archaeological evidence. There are other things that happen in the world that there isn't clear archaeological evidence to, and the Egyptians certainly controlled how they wanted things to be presented and preserved.
I have a question.
Yes.
What period was Akhenaten and his Sun Revolution in terms of the Exodus?
I'm sorry, what period was the what?
Akhenaten and the worship of the sun god.
In terms of the Exodus.
Right.
I mean, so it's hard to put things, directly related, just because there's so many different ideas of dates of the Exodus. So the date that I told you, which was around, again, it's all circa 1450 BCE, which is according to Tanakh. Again, we got the date from Malachim Aleph, is one date. But there's the other date of Ramses is 1290 BCE. So that's a span of about 150, more than 150 years that people say the Exodus could have happened. So, it's hard to date things, because it's such a wide range of when people date things. Also, I'm giving you dates mostly according to Tanakh, but if you date things according to ancient Egyptian dating, it kind of throws off a lot of a lot of the dates that I've been giving you also. So it's hard for me to answer like, specific things like that. But now there was, interestingly enough, I think in around 1977, Menachem Begin said something about the Jews building the pyramids. I think there was a very famous thing that he said, and I very often get that question from people: did the Jews build the pyramids? So first of all, there are many pyramids in ancient Egypt, so it's kind of a very broad question, but I'm assuming when people ask that question, they're usually asking about the Great Pyramids of Giza, because those are the most famous. So that I can tell you right away, was certainly were not built by the Jews, because the pyramids of Giza were built over a span of 85 years, but somewhere between 2589 BCE to 2504. And that's way before the Jews were there, because the date that we say that the Jews were in ancient Egypt, we were there about 210 years, right? So we date that from, let's say, 1650 to 1450. Again, there are different opinions about that, but no matter how you date it, we certainly were not there in 2500 BCE. So the Jews did not build the Great Pyramids. They certainly did build things in ancient Egypt, but not the Great Pyramids. But there are things that are dated to that time span, which we could, conceivably say that perhaps the Jews were involved in building. Although something else to keep in mind, as you saw from the Mecca models, is there were many slaves in ancient Egypt. Anytime Egypt conquered another nation or another area, they took those people as slaves. So there were many different slave groups in ancient Egypt. And we see that actually in a lot of the paintings, indicated sometimes by skin color, how many different slave groups and how many slaves there were in ancient Egypt. So we don't know exactly what, the Jews built when they were slaves.
Any other questions or comments?
When you said the Egyptians ate meat, they weren't vegetarians, but yet you have Yosef feeding his brothers when they come down and sitting them apart from the Egyptians. You have when Yaakov goes down with them, they tell Pharaoh they can't live with the Egyptians because they're shepherds and they're dealing with cattle. And then when they're slaves and Moshe goes and he says, we want to go and sacrifice to our God, but we have to go out into the desert because we can't do it in front of your people because they don't want to see us killing your gods. So you have several references indicating that the Egyptians didn't eat meat or treated their animals with, as if they were their gods.
Right. So again, there different ways to look at those sources. It is possible that they ate certain meat and didn't eat other kind of meat. Not every. If you look at different gods and goddesses and animals that they're represented as, it's interesting. A lot of them are not animals that you would eat. Like if you look at not necessarily the Temple of Dendor, but other paintings or other things that we have where they represent Egyptian gods. So it's a lot of times different kind of monkeys. We have lions. So different kind of animals that weren't necessarily, like if I think about it, a lot of the animals that are represented as gods were not animals that they would have been eating or slaughtering.
So then what was the problem with the Jews being shepherds and wanting to sacrifice, sheep and cattle and stuff?
So, it's actually an interesting question, because we definitely have sources showing Egyptians eating meat. Even, the Mecca where I showed you, he had his own slaughterhouse. They were eating that meat. So I don't know, it could have been different areas, depending on where people lived, maybe around where the Jews were being shepherds, maybe people around there didn't eat meat and it was, upsetting to them. Could have been a class thing also. All the information that we have and all of the artifacts that we have in the museum are, of course, from upper class people, because who could afford to have all these objects made, and who were buried in these tombs, but they were only upper class people. Perhaps they were the ones who were eating meat, but the regular people weren't. And so regular people, everyday people, seeing the Jews being shepherds or, you know, eating meat could have been very upsetting to them.
Well, I know that the Torah says that Pharaoh had shepherds. He had flocks. But, and
Right.
you know, everybody, there are maybe things, there are always occupations that are dissed, shall we put it that way? And maybe being a shepherd was a very low class occupation that, you know, we don't want to do it, but it's fine if you guys are going to do it. But we just don't want to be near you while you're doing it.
Yes.
I'm just mindful of the time. Any last quick question or comment?
Do you know if there's any indication of the land of Goshen, whether Goshen was a real place that's identified as anything, or?
Right, so it's an interesting question. I actually was reading an article that was saying it's very unlike Israel, where you know, names from ancient times can still today are used or can be identified. In ancient Egypt, it's not like that. So you know, like we don't know where that area was necessarily, because the names changed over times and we don't have enough of identifying information to know exactly where it is.
Any really last quick question or comment?
You know what? I'm happy to put my address, my email address in the chat, so that if anyone does have any other questions, you can feel free to email me, or if you have any information that sometimes people send me interesting information that they've read about or heard about. I'm always happy to hear that or get any questions. So I'm going to put my name in the chat. And if you think of any other questions or comments, please feel free to be in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Alana, and it's good seeing everyone. And
Thank you.
this is certainly very interesting to me, and I'm sure for everyone as well. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, great. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Alana.
Thank you.
Thanks.